I also want to welcome Catherine Hilliard and Alex Hilliard, who are relatives of Bob Hilliard, and welcome to our
Actually,
group.
Catherine is my bride, and Alex is my son. So.
Thank you. That was much smoother. I was just going to let them wonder. Okay.
Everybody does.
So I want to just take a minute to connect up what Bob Hilliard's going to talk about with what we've been doing in Section 3. And for those of you who had Section 3 in last year or the year before, I just want to say kind of what was missing. So what we've done in the bargain class, not that anything's missing, but if there were, what we've done in the bargain class is focus on how to make legal claims, on legal doctrine, and what the obstacles to those claims are, what claims are viable and not viable in contemporary law, and the justifications and legal arguments that are used to legitimate this picture of the way we should be together as being one that's just, that's legal, as opposed to political. And as you know, we've pursued an internal critique, trying to pull apart the analytics of those justificatory schemes to show that it is a false ideology of legitimation that the basic relations in American society are legal as opposed to political, even those that are governed by the legal rules. So we've pursued an internal critique, and the point of that internal critique has been to try to help establish a critical distance or dislodge us from the compelling quality of the claim of a rule of law, not people, the attraction to that, the sense that the system's all going to work it out, everybody gets a lawyer, and justice will result, a sense that tends to, from my perspective, deaden our own existential relationship to what we are doing as lawyers. So just want to acknowledge we've pursued a negative critique to try to dislodge the persuasive hold of the reigning ideology. But there is a lot more to legal practice than the negative critique. We also are finding ourselves in the legal profession and having to come to terms with how to infuse our practice of law with meaning. If the meaning's not to be found in the dominant justificatory system of everybody gets a lawyer and justice will emerge, then how do we as lawyers inject and infuse meaning into a legal practice? So that's and I want to introduce you all to Bob also. So this group of Section 3 students is exceptionally brilliant. I've just tried to use a bunch of the big words that somewhat indicates the level beyond just the rules of contract and tort that they have mastered in a critical approach to law. Beyond the intellectual qualifications of the group that you will be speaking to, the Section 3 community has emerged as a warm and generous and decent community who has made, just even from the perspective of your teachers, we feel your warmth and generosity and your inclusion, and it's not just the sweets, but that does really sweeten everything up. So I guess what I'm saying to Bob is this is a community that's very smart at critically understanding or studying now, beginning to understand the limitations of law as at least legal doctrine as a system for justice, and so this is the situation. So I've asked Bob Hilliard because, like you, he is also brilliant, extremely skilled lawyer, and he's a plaintiff side torts trial lawyer for the most part, and so most trial lawyers, the way you introduce them is you say, he got an X $million verdict here, and he got a Y $1 million verdict there, and I sent out some information to you all about his bio, and so you saw he's gotten all those verdicts. He's gotten these huge verdicts. But the reason I've asked Bob to talk with us at this point in our studies together is because my sense is that his understanding of the meaning of legal practice is beyond getting the verdicts one way or the other, as important as that is for his clients. And so my sense is that Bob is connected to an existential, meaning-level understanding of what he is doing in law and legal practice. That's an important complement, one of the roots, not the only root, but one of the roots that if you're buying the critique that the meaning can't be found in the doctrine, one of the roots to find meaning in your future legal practice. So when we first came across Bob, we were doing some legal work, and I asked Betsy Kuhn. Everybody knows Betsy Kuhn, right? Who is largely responsible for hassling with the pizza people and the soda people and everything. And so can we have another round of applause? Betsy loves to be on the spot. And, I'm sorry about that, Betsy. Anyway, so Betsy, let's find some background on Bob. And so Betsy came up with a story. She came up with the list of the things he's accomplished. And I should say a little more about his practice. He has worked on behalf of the powerless against the powerful incessantly, and has earned the nickname Bulldog, which is a compliment, except when used by the defense counsel. He has, and on just the legal front, established constitutional restraints on American power with respect to undocumented immigrants and the treatment by the Border Patrol. Has accomplished a great deal and is skilled in law. But when we did a little research, we found this story, and that's the story that is the avenue, I think, into a deeper level of meaning that I hope Bob is going to talk about today. And that's when he represented a man who had been wrongly convicted of manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, in the automobile death of someone else. He was driving a Toyota, and Bob had actually been representing, from a consumer perspective, from a wrongful death perspective, the family of the person that had been killed in this tragedy. And the driver was in jail for involuntary manslaughter. And during the course of the representation, Bob began to believe that the man in prison was innocent, and that, in fact, the problem was the Toyota, that there was a problem in the Toyota that caused everything, and it was all blamed on his driving. And so he, I won't say dropped, because Bob doesn't, I don't think, view his clients as people to drop, but after consultation with the wrongful death clients, he decided to take on the representation of the individual who was wrongfully in prison. And he won and got him out, and that's the kind of, from a material perspective, the really important part of the story. But when he was released, Bob was there with him at his house upon his release, helping to build a swing set so that when he came home from prison, his family would associate him coming home with joy, with a reconnection of the family, with this positive thing that had happened. And I'm claiming that is an avenue into a level of perception and depth about meaning in legal practice that's asked Bob to talk today with us about the soul of law. So I'll turn it over to Bob Hilliard. Let's welcome him.
Good morning. When I was coming over here this morning, I wanted to consider how to best talk to first-year law students about what you have no idea as of yet what's going to happen in your practice, what you want to do, perhaps how you want to do it. Don't worry, I do that all the time. In fact, when I'm trying cases, the thing I always do is lose my glasses, and by the end of the trial, I'll say, "Where are my glasses?" to my co-counsel, and the jurors will speak up. It becomes a sub-theme of where did Hilliard leave his glasses? And you'll hear a juror say, "They're over there by the witness stands." But, that kind of segues into the point I'm getting at, and that is you have to be careful with what law school can do to you, even with extraordinary people like Gary, and I'm going to speak about him in a few minutes. You have to be careful that what law school will do to you, if you let it, what it did to me for a number of years, and what it is designed to do is take you away from the person you were before you started law school. Move you from a place of feeling and understanding and empathy into a place of black and white law. Now, black and white law is as important as empathy, but it does not trump it. An example that I like to give is, so I played a lot of tennis growing up. I played in college. My son Alex played at University of Texas, and to get to that level, you have to practice, and you have to do it right. You can't just go out there and improvise. Beethoven had to do it right forever before he figured it out. But there comes a point after you've got it down, after you understand it, when you can then take the game and make it who you are. Instead of taking yourself and saying, I am confined, restrained, and restricted by this choice that I've made on my sport or my profession. Law is worse than sports in that, you're going to, when you get out, perhaps go to a law firm that has expectations. They really don't care how you're going to feel. They don't care, what your personal thoughts are. They're going to want you to either, bill and work or write and produce. And a lot of you may do that, and that's okay for a while. But sooner or later, and I'll push the pause button. So I teach lawyers how to be people, older lawyers, middle-aged lawyers, lawyers who are saying, I'm going to quit or I'm going to change how I practice law. So I've been part of a group for a long time out at the Trial Lawyers College that I'm not part of anymore, but our goal is to bring lawyers back to people. And believe it or not, you guys are probably better lawyers now than you will be in 3 years because you're still closer to being the person you were when you got into law school than you're going to be when you get out. And it's a recognition more than a critique, because you're probably sitting there thinking, I don't know, but thinking, you got finals in a week. This guy, it's easy for him to say because he's 35 years out, and he's kind of looking back saying it was not that tough. And, after I eat this pizza, I got to go study, so whatever. But, the struggle itself actually connects you to the person that you need to be in order to represent the folks that need representing. I want to give you, in a way, through this talk, permission and courage and strength to remember as you go through your practice, especially the early stages, you don't need to be stuck. You guys are literally some of the best and the brightest in the country, and I want to claim you for the folks who need you, for the folks who need me, for the folks who I've decided to represent. I want to say, there's other ways to live a nice life and to enjoy what you have other than kind of the road more traveled, perhaps. So I'm going to tell you a few stories. I'm going to give you my comments, but I'm going to be very sensitive to the fact that this is my story. This is not your story. When I try a case in front of a jury, what I try to do is not try to think about what is the jury, what is their story, what do they think. I know that if I make it my story, there's going to be a connection. And I'm going to give you an example. So yesterday morning at Incarnate Word Academy in Corpus Christi, Texas, it was Donuts with Dad. So me and Tobin Grace, my 5-year-old daughter, and Allie, my 9-year-old daughter, went to Donuts with Dad. It's in the library, and all the dads have to come in, and we're all looking at each other because we don't go to these that often, maybe. So I'm keeping an eye on my daughter, and she's kind of standing next to her sister, and she's kind of starting out her life in this place, and so she's a little, not scared, but just cautious. And I catch her glancing at me now and then, just a quick glance. You know, and it's just a kind of an assurance glance, and I'm just standing around, just being present. So that, you know, I understood the significance to her that she didn't understand yet about the power of knowing I'm near. So let's say, in my General Motors cases, I have, and I do have, fathers who have died in the accident and left minor children. And my charge is to tell their story in front of a jury. You know, I will never know their story, but I know the universal feeling of a daughter and a father, and I will tell my story. And every single jury will be sitting there like you guys now thinking about, yeah, I remember that with my dad. Or I remember that with my daughter, if some of you have kids. If some of you guys have daughters, who knows. But the point is, you can't modify the power that you bring as one person sitting in any chair in this room because you're in a courtroom, you're in front of Judge Hardass in some federal court, doesn't matter. You know, you got the best defense lawyer in the country who's pushing you around, doesn't matter. You know, the story will always shine if you understand yourself. Because if you understand yourself, then you'll understand your story. And that story will always cause a connection. Always, 100% of the time. Gary was talking about Kua Fong Lee, and I'm going to tell you his story because it's remarkable to me. So he was leaving church on a Sunday with his pregnant wife and car-seated daughter and his elderly father, and his Toyota suddenly accelerated and he hit a stopped car from behind and he killed 3 people. Paralyzed a little girl. She died a year later. He was Hmong. He came over from Vietnam, didn't speak the language. He was a minority in a city that is sensitive to minorities, and not always in a good way. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. No drugs, no alcohol. 8 years. He had 3 kids, and by the time he went to prison, his wife was pregnant with who she named Angel, the only child that doesn't have a Hmong name because she delivered him while Kua was in prison. So I was contacted, like Gary said, to represent the family of the folks who were hit. And I asked the lawyer who had contacted me, what about the guy in jail? And there was a disagreement about what we should do with him, so I decided that I wanted to help him. I reached out to his criminal defense lawyer, who is now, and still is, who is now a very good friend of mine. And we convinced the judge to give us a hearing, and we put on testimony for 4 days in front of the judge. And the district attorney was on the other side yelling the whole time, you know, this is bullshit, this isn't right, this guy did it, Hilliard, you know, this is all smoke and mirrors. But I knew the story, and this guy the guy on the other side was fairly aggressive about it. And this was the same judge who had sentenced him to 8 years in prison. The courtroom was packed. The car that he hit was African American. He was Hmong. There had been a huge, huge rift between the communities when this accident happened. And so at the end of the case, the judge came out, and she had a written opinion. And I still remember, and it's kind of hard to talk about without really taking a breath, because she looked at him and she says, you know, I think even I let you down. And she freed him that day to go home that day. That morning, before we knew what she was going to do, I went over to the district attorney's office, uninvited. And I asked him, hey, do you have a minute? And I sat down and I said, look, I said, I'm going to win this. And it has nothing to do with you. I have the facts. You're just, you know, you're stuck. I said, why don't we go in together? And why don't we say together that you now understand, as I do, this is not a criminal behavior on Kua's part. This was potentially a defective vehicle. And he says, well, what's in it for me? And I said, you just get to live another day, brother. That's it. And literally shouted me out of his office, throwing F-bombs left and right. So then they show up at the courtroom and they say, we're going to cut a deal with you, Mr. Lee. If you plead guilty to 1 count, we'll release you today. So think about Kua Fong Lee. And look him up if you want. He's an amazing guy. He can leave today from jail with a felony conviction, or he can chance it, see what the judge does, and if she says denied, he's got 3.5 more years in prison. And he says no. He says, I didn't do this, I don't accept it. And we put him on the stand, we swore him in, and he told the judge and the whole courtroom, nope, I'm not going to do it. I'd rather stay 3 more years in prison than have my children think that I did something and pled guilty to something that I'm not responsible for. And the judge let him go that day. So then, fast forward, we finally last month got to put Toyota on trial in federal court in Minnesota. 6-week trial. The folks who were on the side of the criminal side, the African American folks, they were now on our side. And we had made an agreement that I would try the case for everybody, for them and for Kua, against Toyota. And Toyota's attorney was kind of the same way that the district attorney was. This is Mr. Lee's fault. It may not have been criminal, but it was an act of negligence. There's nothing wrong with this car. And after 3 or 4 days of deliberation, the jury awarded $11 million and said it was Toyota's fault. A great result, civilly, absolutely. But Gary hit it on the head, and that is when I think of Kua Fong Lee, I think of going to his little house, and it's probably 800 square feet, and his 4 kids who are, they've come to Corpus. They hang out with our kids. And I think that, that is someone that, maybe there would have been another guy like me. Maybe there's someone like me sitting there waiting to help the next Kua Fong Lee. Who knows? So that was Mr. Lee's story. I've kind of taken you to the last thing I did. I wanted to more give you some sense that we have a connection, and that when I started my practice of law, the only reason I started is because the guy that hired me fired me. And I didn't, I was 2 years with him, and he fired me, and so I had to go buy a Radio Shack phone and rent an office as big as this desk and just start practicing law, and just figure it out as I went. I grew up at a time where I was fortunate to try a lot of lawsuits, and I tried a lot of them. Let me talk about Gary for a minute, because as I told him before, I wouldn't travel this far and do this for a lot of folks, and he and I are really just starting our relationship, but the reason I feel connected to him is, and we really haven't talked about his physical issue with his right arm, but he reminds me of a client that I represented that had the same thing. Her name was Kelly Havner, and her mother took a drug called Bendectin for morning sickness, and it caused her right arm not to form. Merrill Dow knew it would happen, but they had a hole in their balance sheet because thalidomide was killing babies and making them into flipper kids, and so they put this on the market in 90 days, and if you take it when the limb buds are forming, the limbs don't form. It's a teratogen. It goes through the placenta. So we proved our case for little Kelly Havner. We won. We met our burden. We met under the Texas rules the evidence necessary. And 5 years later, our Texas Supreme Court said, we are changing the rule. We are implementing, you may not know this yet, but there's a U.S. Supreme Court case called Daubert versus Merrill Dow. Daubert is kind of the gatekeeper standard. It tells judges, you can't let experts testify unless they meet these 7 elements. Daubert is Kelly Havner on a federal level. So our Texas Supreme Court changed the law. And they said, in Hilliard, you didn't meet this law, so reversed and rendered. They kicked her out, and they wouldn't let us come back and try it under the new standard, which didn't exist when I did try. I can always tell when I start talking a little faster and louder that I'm still aggravated by it all these years later. So, I never took issue with the Supreme Court about changing the law. It's their prerogative. They can do what they want. What I took issue with is they didn't send us back to give us a chance under the new law. So I filed a motion for rehearing, which got a lot of play, made 60 minutes, sent me to the grievance committee unsuccessfully, but it did because I called the Texas Supreme Court 9 nutty professors and compared them to one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And I'm an English literature major, and I wrote it real well. You ought to pull it up. It's very good. But the problem when you do something like that is there's a lot of nuts out there who write really bad stuff that think we're like brothers. And I would get calls from lawyers all over the case that had written terribly, just bad briefs using just terrible words. But I remember when the Supreme Court notified me that I was to decide if I was going to withdraw it or show cause why they shouldn't sanction me, I signed an affidavit, a 2-page affidavit that said, this isn't a game. And if I do that, then it becomes a game. And regardless of what you think, my personal strength and my love for Kelly Havner requires me to do this. And I know you're wrong. And I would do it again if I had to. And this is the only way I want to practice law. It's the only way I can practice law. And I filed it with the Texas Supreme Court. So they, true to their word, sent me to the grievance committee. Conduct unbecoming of a lawyer. And so we went to the grievance committee, and I hired a couple good lawyers because, I like my law license. So I had a big dispute with one of my lawyers I hired. He said, "You got to withdraw that affidavit, dude." He said, "They're going to pull your ticket." He said, "You've got to go in there and say, look, heat of the moment, I'm sorry." And I said, "Nope, not going to happen." I said, it is a true affidavit. It is my sworn belief of my day in and day out struggle to, do this within a really tough profession, to practice the law. So we go in there, and there was stacks and stacks of paper. The Texas Supreme Court has sent 2 Texas Attorney Generals, and we're sitting in the room, and the chairman says, he pulls out my affidavit, and he slides it to me and says, "I just want to confirm whether or not you affirm this affidavit." And I said, "I signed it then, I'll sign it now." And, to this day, I still remember he says, "We can choose to hear or not hear evidence. We choose not to hear evidence. Wait outside." So we wait outside, and within 5 minutes, they dismiss the grievance. And I remember there was one non-lawyer on the grievance committee, an older Hispanic woman, and I heard later that she had looked at those Texas Attorney Generals and said, "Who do they think they are that they can't be criticized?" The Texas Supreme Court. But at the time, in real time, when there wasn't a friend to be found because I was the guy in the spotlight, maybe you're going to face that one day. Maybe you're going to have to say, what do I do? How do I do it? And for whom do I want to be remembered standing next to? That's always going to be a tough choice, tougher in the future, when you're facing preschool for your kids, mortgages, light bills. There is a practicality that comes with practicing law. I understand that. But I will tell you this because I have seen it a million times. Lawyers who start their practice and never wake up, metaphorically. They put their head down, work their rears off, and make a nice living, but they never wake up. They one day wake up and they're not happy. They're either alcoholics, they turn to drugs, they're just looking at their life saying this cannot be it. And those lawyers oftentimes find their way to that place I told you about in Wyoming that I used to teach, and they wanted to find a different way to do it, a more human way to do it. And it would have to start, and what we start with back then is coming back to where you guys are now, to the place that you are now. You may be sitting there thinking, I've got to become more of a lawyer. I've got to become more of a law student. I have to understand all the nuance of what has to be done. And maybe so, maybe like McEnroe in tennis, he could forget all the rules once he knew all the rules. Maybe that's what you have to do right now. I get that. But my suggestion to you is don't forget that's temporary. Do not, once you get it down and you understand it and you're starting to get the admiration of your peers once you get your law license, do not ever believe that that's the permanent place you need to be. Because, the law is a jealous mistress, there's no doubt about it, but, if you want to go home at night and have a true relationship with a person you love, if you want to raise kids the way you want them to be raised, that need and that desire and that power will translate into when you come to the office and when you do whatever you want to do. One thing that surprised me going back to the Minnesota case is one of the lawyers who was a very good lawyer in Minnesota that I hired to be a kind of my law person, he said, we were taught in law school that you never ask a question on cross-examination that you don't know the answer to. He says, you only ask questions on cross-examination that you don't know the answer to. And you get away with it. And what I told him, I said, it's not getting away with anything. Here's what it is. And maybe none of you want to be trial lawyers. Maybe some of you are thinking, maybe I will be a trial lawyer. And trial lawyers, they're damn important. Because Gary's exactly right. It's not about justice. It's about understanding how to get to justice. And justice, a lot of times, ends up in jail for 8 years if there's not the right person talking and understanding. So what I told that lawyer is, I said, look, I knew what the truth was. I know what the story is. If they put a witness on the stand that tells me something that I know not to be true, then I can react and talk with him about that, and I can expose it in real time, and I'm comfortable and confident that I can do that, regardless of what he says, regardless of how rehearsed he may be. I'll listen to him, and I'll slowly let the jury see that he's not telling the truth. All right, now this is after that guy fired me, the first case I tried was a guy named Donnie Contreras. Donnie Contreras was a wheelchair athlete, and he was up in Dallas competing in a wheelchair athletic event, and he was staying at a Holiday Inn, and he burnt himself in the bathroom badly because the hot water handle was installed backwards, and he was next to the boiler. And for his room to get, for the last room and the last floor to get pretty hot water, they had to scald that room. But he couldn't feel it, so he didn't know initially that he was shutting off the cold and cranking up the hot. So he looked down and his skin was peeling off his feet. So he shut it off. Remember, no conscious pain and suffering, which is an element that the jury considers in awarding damages. And my first trial, literally, by myself. And Donnie and I were still friends. And I've got to, if we have time, tell you one more connection that's frankly amazing about him. But we're sitting in my little Radio Shack phone office, and we're about the same age, mid-20s, late 20s. Our birthdays are on the same day, and I'm scared as hell, I really am. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to try his case. And we go to trial. The defense lawyer has offered some money, but not a lot, and he gets my old boss to come into the courtroom and in front of Donnie say in this stage whisper, you really ought to take that money. You're never going to get more than that. Donnie's looking at me, I'm looking at him, and we decide not to. So the first witness I put on the stand is the engineer who's going to say, what's wrong with this plumbing? And we take a break, and I go to the bathroom next to the courtroom, and I hear a noise coming from the stall that I remember from college, and I'm so tall, I peek over, and my expert is taking a bong hit in the courthouse. No kidding. Literally. This is a guy I hired to come be the expert. And he doesn't know that I've looked down. And I don't know, now, it's a story I can tell, but back then in real time, I have this oh shit moment that you would not believe. And I'm walking back into the courtroom, and in my mind I'm going, do I have a duty here? Do I have to, what's going on? And I sit down, and Donnie looks at me, and he goes, what's wrong? I said, nothing's wrong. And I'd finished my direct, so this guy was coming back for cross-examination. So he walks back in, and I'm watching him, and literally I can't even think enough to come up with a plan. I don't know what to do. And so he gets on the stand, and they have this big plumbing device which didn't work right. And the very good defense lawyer was cross-examining him. And the question was something like, well, what do you mean that water can't go through this device? You saying it's stuck? So the guy picks up this big brass device like it's a trumpet, and he tries to blow it, and his cheeks turn purple, and no air goes through, and it was the best demonstrative thing I've ever seen. And then when he's done, the judge says, do you have any redirect? I said, no, Your Honor. And so he walks out, and Donnie Contreras testifies next, and he gets up there and pops a wheelie and turns around, and I say to him, you know, what happens when you fall out of that wheelchair? And he says, I just get back on that horse, which moves me into, as good as cases are, you have to be able to create an environment and a relationship where your client is comfortable being who they need to be, their real selves, in front of a jury. What I told Donnie, what I tell all of the folks who testify, you're going to be scared, it's going to be unusual, but look at me. You know, I will take you to the place you need to go, we will talk together, and you will feel the permission to do what you need to do to be sure they hear you. And you have to have the relationship with your client to do that. I know a lot of great lawyers who do what I do, but they cannot get to that next step. They love the adversarialness of it, as do I. They love the cross-examination. They love the being, you know, having more testosterone than the other lawyer, but they cannot stop that and say, okay, that's not what this is about right now. This is about, you know, Kua Fong Lee talking to the jury about how did that feel. Donnie Contreras sharing what he had to share. So, in order to put an exclamation point on there are no coincidences, I got to connect Donnie Contreras to Dax Cowart. When I went to the Trial Lawyers College in '95, I met a guy who was blind. No arm, no hands, severely disfigured. He was one of my classmates. I'd gone through it. And he had actually, I didn't know he was blind, and when I first met him, I said, you know, Dax, you have these beautiful blue eyes. They remind me of my daughter Emily's eyes. And he kind of smiles. He goes, they're plastic, Bob. So Dax Cowart and I became friends, lifelong friends, and after a while, he had quit practicing law. So think about this. Dax Cowart was a pilot, a fighter pilot, and he looked like James Dean. He was in a terrible accident with his father where they drove to check on some property. Some propane gas you couldn't smell ignited when their car didn't start. They were burned severely, and his dad died holding his hand in the same ambulance going up to Dallas, same hospital they took John Kennedy to. Dax then slowly tried to regain his life. He lost his eyes, he lost his hands. He started to travel around with the doctor who treated him because Dax wanted the right to die. The doctor wouldn't let him die. So they go to medical schools now, and they talk to ethics classes. And Dax says, I'm happy to be alive, but it was my choice. And the doctor says, I'm happy he's alive too, and I didn't think he could make that choice. Another chance to stay connected with the beauty and weirdness of the world if you have time to look up Dax Cowart. So I invite Dax Cowart down to Corpus Christi to work with me. And he had quit practicing law, but more phenomenally, he had graduated from Texas Tech Law School, blind with no hands. He couldn't read Braille. And he had quit practicing because he has a hard time sleeping because night is day and day is night and everything's black. We became very close, and I said, come practice with me. You know, I will give you a chance to be a trial lawyer. And so he said, okay, I'll come. So he comes to Corpus, and I give him his own case to try, a very important case where a worker fell through an attic of a new house where she was hired to clean the windows because the builder had sprayed insulation so high she didn't know where the sheetrock was and where the wood was, and she was paralyzed. And that was Dax's case. And I had a lawyer next to him who would show him where the jury was, where the judge was, and he told her story. Now think about that. Really, just look at all you folks here. You know, everyone has their own issues, but, you know, we all can see. We all can get up and walk away from this room without anyone helping us. We all can go to sleep at night, go to the bathroom. We can do everything. He can't do anything. So he tries this whole case, and he does a good job. And I go over to listen to him in closing argument, and he tells me beforehand, he said, look, I'm going to sing a Bob Dylan song during closing argument. He said, I'm going to sing The Girl from the North Country. And I said, why are you going to do that? He says, because that's what it means to me. I said, okay. I said, go for it, man. So I go over there, and I'm sitting in the outside the bar, and he gets up there, and he has this beautiful white oak cane, and then he clears his throat, and, I love Dax like a brother, but he cannot sing. No way about it. I tell him to his face, too. And he clears his voice, and he starts to sing this song, The Girl from the North Country. And the theme is, give her a jacket, it's getting cold, we have to help each other. I got the connection. I understood it, and it meant a lot to him. And I was watching juror number 1, and the first thing she did was cross her arms and kind of look away. And after about a minute, I saw her uncross her arms, and she was still looking away, and then I saw her look at him, and then by the end of it, he could have been on The Voice as far as she was concerned. He was committed to it. It was his deal, and he earned the $7 million verdict that he got from that. So now you know some stories about the level of courage it takes for some people just to do what you're about to get to do. Perhaps you don't yet understand completely that you have a choice within reason and within the realms of your own life to always keep an eye on who needs you the most. One thing that I am faced and that the lawyers in my firm are faced with day in and day out is the best and the brightest are always taken by the guys on the sign out in the hallway that sponsor all these events. They are the best defense lawyers in the country. They make the best offers, and understandably, they get the cream of the crop a lot of times. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's the Gary Pellers of the world who remind you that there's another way to do the things that you want to do. There's another way to connect with the things that you want to connect with. And it's, and not when I come to die, discover that I had not lived. Everybody knows that quote. But in a way, I don't know all the verdicts that I got, and I forget them slowly over time, but I always remember, the sense of love that I have for the Lee family, for Donnie Contreras, for Kelly Havner, for the folks that I have met who have suffered because of General Motors and have lost someone. Tomorrow in Virginia is going to be a wine tasting for Laura Goss. Laura Goss was a third-year law student at Washington and Lee. She's the daughter of Jerry and Jay Goss. She was top of her class. She was head of the Innocent Project. She was our country's, just like y'all, our country's brightest star. And she died because of a defect in the GM car on her way to clerk for a federal judge. And I met Jerry and Jay because of what I do for GM. And I told them from day one, and I told Emily, Emily's not here, Alex's sister, because she got sick and had to go home. But Laura Goss is Emily Hilliard. I mean, they're identical in a lot of ways. And so I connected with the loss. And the feeling that I see when we went to testify on the Hill, and all of the best and the brightest from Washington and Lee who were clerking came up to Jerry and Jay and remembered her. And so, God forbid that ever happens, but it does happen. And there's got to be guys like me. There's got to be women and men like you who over time never forget, I'm going to do something for somebody. And at the end of the day, metaphorically, miles to go before I sleep is repeated twice because it means two things. It means miles to go before I sleep today and miles to go before I sleep when I die. So when it comes time to ultimately not travel any more miles and finally sleep, just always remember that, It's not about pride. It's about developing the power inside of yourself to evolve continually, and over time, that power will be more rewarding, more successful than you can ever imagine. Trust me on that. And if anyone wants to move down to Corpus Christi, come see me. I can put you in a courtroom pretty quickly. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Answer questions, and this is a great opportunity for you to ask somebody like who was the top experience anything you'd like, I think.
Sure.
So let's just open up the floor, and Bob, you want to recognize people?
Yeah, sure.
How did you find Donnie, or Donnie find you that first one?
So Donnie Contreras had hired the guy that fired me, and when he fired me, he said, just contact the folks who you represent and tell them you're leaving. So I sent everybody a letter, and Donnie called and said, I don't want to stay with that guy. I want to go with you. So I went to the guy that fired me, and I said, Donnie Contreras wants to go with me. And he said, what happened in the case? And I told him. He said, take it. And, and I'll tell you the verdict in that case. So I argued for $300,000, and the jury gave him $500,000. Amazing. The judge to this day, when he sees me, he goes, you're the only lawyer that got more than you asked for. And I said, Judge, that's not a good thing. And I'm going back to Donnie because I interviewed one of the jurors afterwards, and the big issue was the only thing that had prevented him from doing was competing in his wheelchair events for a year during the skin grafts. He taught school. He was an amazing guy, and she said to me, in regards to how much they awarded, which back in '85 was a lot, and she said, look, I play softball recreationally. It's what keeps me sane. And I understood what you meant when you said you take something away that's really not recreational, but it is your, tuning fork for sanity. That has value. And she said, I believed it did.
One thing I've wondered, and I want to know if you've thought about, when you're going against the other side, like the Texas Supreme Court or the Merrill Dows of the world, do you try to think about what's in their heart? What do they believe that they're doing, if they believe that they're on the right side of the issue? Because sometimes it's easy for me just to feel like, they're just evil and they don't have a heart. But do you try to think about, what is their sense of justice, of fairness in what they're trying to argue?
Generally I treat defense lawyers like human beings. I try to be friendly with them because they are, I try to get to know them, try to understand them, and try to have a relationship with them because two reasons. It cuts through the a lot of the BS necessary to lay predicate for evidence that we all know is coming in, but we can save time if we can just stipulate to it, but there has to be trust. And there's been times when I've had the best relationship from day one till after the jury verdict with defense lawyers. And there are defense lawyers who can call me up and say, I want to do this deal with you. And I won't even say, send me a letter and let's put it in writing. I'll just say, okay. But there's a flip side to that because do not think that what I've told you gives anyone permission to think you're a pushover and that you don't have the fire necessary. Because if any defense lawyer kind of betrays the unwritten agreement that we have about how we're going to try the case, how the facts need to come in, and you know it when it happens, if they overstep their bounds or they go after me or they go after something inappropriately, I respond more aggressively. And I do it in front of the jury, and I do it directly to them. And if the judge doesn't like it, what I found from jurors is sometimes they side with me if the judge is on me about what I just said to that defense lawyer. And I don't do it simply because in my mind I'm going, well, he overstepped the bounds, what should I do? It is my true reaction to what I see that's going on inside a living, breathing arena of the courtroom. It is really the only place where you can take your ability to tell a true story, your understanding of the law and the facts and your environment, and you can really put on, an existential play, because it's not scripted. Some of my mentors always scripted everything. It's subjective, but I don't. I kind of have points I know I want to make, and I have a list of those points, but I listen and then make a decision about where I want to go. And if a defense lawyer interferes with that, and I know he's doing it on purpose to either break my, kick in his butt train of thought, or just to change the dynamics of what he senses is going on, and good defense lawyers know when they better just stand up and stop this. Then it becomes about them, and you expose them in front of the jury, Judge, objection, Mr. Hilliard's just talking. I say, Your Honor, there's no reason for him to be standing up right now, except he wants this jury to know that what I'm saying is true, and he's afraid they're going to believe me. They don't stand up a second time. And the judge, regardless of what the judge says, it's all about, making sure that everyone understands boundaries and the consequence of not following those boundaries. And, I'm fortunate now. I deal with very, very, very good lawyers at the level that I have gotten to, and they understand. They don't want to see that in me, and I don't want to see that in them. And, they have to let me try my case, let me tell my story, and I will let them put on their defense. And then we'll summarize for the jury, and we'll see what happens. But you don't have to hate them until they desert.
I saw the news about the GM case that came out a couple days ago, or I guess yesterday, a couple days ago, and I was just wondering if you could talk about what the next steps for that case is.
Yesterday, or day before yesterday, the federal bankruptcy judge in the Southern District of New York ruled that GM's bankruptcy protects them from being sued for some of the damages that they caused. So not to get into bankruptcy law, but they filed for bankruptcy in 2009. If you were injured or killed pre-2009, you're forever locked out of the courthouse because of that decision. If you were injured and killed in a pre-09 accident after 09, then your cases are still viable. And there's about 1,200 cases inside the class action, or it's actually called a multi-district litigation in New York, that are proceeding to trial. Our first trial is in January. We've scheduled, I'll take the deposition of their CEO, Mary Barra, their general counsel, Mike Milliken, the ground zero witnesses as we prepare, and those start in about 30 days. The difficulty, however, is, for example, my clients who now have to hear from me that this bankruptcy judge, while recognizing that GM knew of the defect, they knew it would kill people, they did not tell him about it when they asked for $30 billion in debt relief. He granted that relief. That opinion now gives him complete and unfettered immunity from any of those pre-09 injuries or death. And I represent 128 of those folks. One of my clients was unfortunate enough to lose his pregnant wife, and he just can't get it. He says, I don't get it. He said, I know bankruptcy is what it's about, and it's important. He said, but they committed actual fraud. They lied to the bankruptcy judge about a potential debt. So that's where it is. It will be appealed to the Second Circuit, and maybe there'll be some relief. What else? Yep.
So you mentioned sort of doing, I guess, what you could say is career counseling for mid-career lawyers, or the lawyers. Was it the Trial Lawyers College in Wyoming? Do you also do that personally? Do you consult with people to do sort of career advice?
I'd like to think that my children suffered through it growing up, that my lawyers in my office, get some of it, but I really don't otherwise. It's kind of, once you understand this, and it was started by a guy named Jerry Spence, who who was on the other side of the rainbow and the spectrum in regards to being very aggressive and being very mean, and he understood there's a better way to do it. So once you understand how to do it, it's just the willingness to do it continually and have other people watch your trials or your depositions or your talks with students who have yet to fall down into that abyss, and keep it going forward. The Trial Lawyers College is available to every one of you guys. I'd recommend it preliminarily.
You definitely forge a really strong relationship with a lot of your clients, and one thing you just mentioned kind of hurt my ears a little bit. Like you said, you might get some relief with the Second Circuit, maybe. In your interactions with your clients, how do you approach like giving them full disclosure when you've got a losing case, or when we can take this to the next step, but it's not looking good? Like, how do you approach that level of just complete forthrightness when they're completely reliant on you to get some recovery or relief or whatever it is that they went through?
Yeah, but it's a real discipline, because while you're trying the case on their behalf, while they're understanding that their story is better than even they understood, you're negotiating settlements all the time. The point is your fiduciary duty is to be sure that you get them the best recovery they can, and I understand the jurors can do what they do. And a good example of that is that Havner case I told you about with that little girl. We got $30.5 million. The jury was out so long, I went across the hall and tried another case. And I didn't want to try it, but they didn't offer any money. So by the end of the case, the defense lawyer had offered what I wanted. So I told my clients, hey, they've made the offer, let's take it. And before we could get it on paper, the Havner jury came back. So my clients walked across the hall, listened to the Havner jury, and said, oh no, we're not settling. And I had to tell them, look, and I only try cases where I can't negotiate a fair settlement for my clients, because it's not about my ego or another verdict. My duty and sole duty is to represent them and get them the best possible monetary deal, because that's the only thing civil lawsuits can do. And the cases I try are the hard ones. The lead case in Minnesota where they had zero money on the table. What am I going to do? I got to try. But I didn't want to put them through it. I didn't want to take Kua Fong Lee back to that day and put him in that car again and let him talk about that morning or his family. If they say no when there's a good offer, then they sign a letter saying it's against my advice. And generally, they won't, though, because of the relationship. They trust me, and I tell them, I work for you, but you need to at least hear why I think you should take this settlement, and then it's your decision. And if you say no, then you're going to acknowledge in writing that you've said no. And I said, and once we walk out of this room and you write no there, I'm going to be your lion in that courtroom. But right now, you got to listen to me. And that's kind of how we go through. So I thought of something that I want to tell you one more story, because you know that country and western song called Hard to Love? I don't know if you know it. So I had one client I did not like. Oh, my God. This was a family of elderly brothers and sisters. They were of German descent. They were farmers, and I had no connection to them, man, none. And they were grouchy, and they had a sad case in that their mother was in a hospital, and she happened to be put in a room with another woman, and some crazy guy came in the room to kill the other woman. And as the guy's leaving, he looks at my client's mother and said, I'm already here. Kills her. It's terrible. So we sue the hospital because they had turned their security guys into maintenance men, and the maintenance men were over at Home Pro buying ant poison. So we had a good theory, but they had a good theory too, in that it's the guy that did it, not us. And so they didn't offer us any money, and I kind of understood why. And two things happened in that trial which convinced me that the only way to go is to really work hard at understanding how you're feeling and use that as a power, not a shield to your true advocacy. So the guy that was a security guard, I said, so you became a guy that also did maintenance work? He goes, that's right. And where were you that day when this guy came on to the hospital grounds? He said, I went to buy ant poison. And you don't see anything wrong with it? He goes, I do not. And literally, I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking to myself, what am I feeling right now? And so I said what I was feeling. I said, I don't know what to do about that. And so we're sitting there, and the first juror is right here, and the defense lawyer's over there, and that juror says, I know what to do about it. And so my co-counsel, I heard it, and he said, did you hear that? And I said, shh. And so, but there would have been a time where I would have just gotten meaner with him, and I would have not given the jury the power to help me. When the jury said, look, Hilliard's not sure what to do, let's be sure that we now are empowered to do something, which is an important point. If you're the toughest badass in the room, the juror's just going to be an uncaring observer of something they're watching on CSI. You have got to empower them by letting them know that this is part of their responsibility to assist in getting to justice. So last part of this story, so Mr. Kasurek has to testify about the loss to his mother. His mother was 90 years old, he's 72, they hadn't talked in a year, though they lived right next to each other. And so it wasn't that great of a case, and he wouldn't, I couldn't connect with him. So I put him on the stand, and I said, I got to lead with this. The defense lawyer came up to me and he said, hey, Bob, so your clients got along pretty good with their mother? So there was one time in my career where I would have said, well, hell yeah, they do. They get along great with them. What are you talking about? But I told him, I looked him in the eye and I said, not really. I said, they really don't. I said, this is a pretty dysfunctional family. And I could see in his eyes that he already knew that. And he was just going to see where I was going. So I put the big oldest brother on the stand. And I said, hey, Mr. Kasurek, so you and your mom lived right next to each other? Yes. I said, but you hadn't talked to her in a year? Nope. How come? We were in a fight. And then he says, I always thought that we would make up. So I suddenly got up, I grabbed a chair, I set it right in front of him, I said, well, here she is. Go ahead. And that 74-year-old man started crying like a baby. Literally, uncontrollably. He had this guilt and this problem with the idea that he had let his own ego get in the way. And this empty chair, caused the jury to find 100% on the hospital, award, this crazy money. And I remember two other things that are important, I think, for you guys, and that is, so the loss of an elderly mother for folks who are already grown. So I used to read to my daughter that book that's called I'll Love You Forever, I'll Like You for Always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. And so I brought it to closing argument. I said, I read this to my daughter. I said, but, as you go through the book, what you learn is there's a point when the son is holding his elderly mother. She takes care of him his whole life, but now she's old, like Miss Kasurek was old, and he would cradle her and say, I love you forever, I like you for always, as long as I'm living, my mother you'll be. And I said, it doesn't matter how old she is. She's the only mom that this guy ever had. And it was true for me. It was the truth for me. And so that completely obliterated any, 90-year-old women aren't worth anything. Sub-flow of the storyline they were trying to sell. And finally, the last thing I did is we had the gruesome photographs of the poor woman who had been killed. Marked them, admitted them, sealed them, put an exhibit on it. Never mentioned them again. And in closing argument, I told the jury, look, here's the deal. She suffered a lot of conscious pain and suffering before she died. I said, and proof of that is in that sealed envelope right there. And when you guys go back and start talking with each other about the value of that suffering, if anyone thinks that they don't really understand or believe how difficult her death was, open that envelope. I'm encouraging you not to. I said, trust me on this. If you open that envelope, you're not going to ever unremember what you see. And trust me on this, it's as bad as you can imagine. And they didn't open it. And it was the truth. It wasn't just I was truly concerned and caring about what would happen to them if they opened it. We got the photographs in, so it was on the record. They were identified and confirmed by the folks who took them, but they had no need to see them. All right.
Let me ask one question. This is a very dramatic time, and this is not going to be dramatic.
Are there going to be big words?
I think that we've been focusing on legal doctrine, and I'm particularly interested when you're conceptualizing the case, and you've evoked really well how you try to tell a drama in human terms. What role the doctrine plays at all? So, for example, we're right now doing products liability doctrine. We're just learning the elements of the doctrine.
Yep.
And Bob mentioned the Minnesota case, and I'll just brag on Bob that in this Minnesota case that he won the $11 million verdict in, he, as far as I could tell, I wasn't there, but I read the news reports, completely sandbagged the Toyota Defense Counsel into believing that his theory of the product defect was one thing, and they spent, am I right about this? Virtually the entire trial. And then Bob, at the end, connects with the jury, connects all the pieces of evidence that pointed to a completely different, I think, or not completely different, but a different theory of the case that ended up prevailing. So he clearly caught the Toyota Defense Counsel flat-footed, which just seems, Bob and his legal team just seems an amazing thing. So basically what I'm asking is, what role, if any, do the doctrinal formalities play? Is it just in the pretrial stuff, and if you've got your claim alive, then that's it, it's setting the parameters, or is the jury understanding the instructions they're getting from the judge in a way that is in tension with the story you're telling?
Yep, okay. So what he was saying about that Lee case, I knew what our theory was, and I knew the record supported it, but I never said it to anybody. I never said to an expert on their side, well, isn't it true that this is wrong, and so you can have an accelerating vehicle? Never brought it up. And there was a lot of discussion, because that takes a lot of discipline. And one of the things the reporter asked me, why didn't you tell Toyota that was your theory? And I told him, look, it's not my job to make sure they listen to the evidence. And they were surprised at closing argument. But I understood the record. I've tried enough cases where I listen to testimony kind of in my mind, I'm seeing it on the record. And so I knew what the charge to the jury was probably going to be. What I do to answer Gary's question is the first thing we do is I want to see what the jury's charge is going to be. What are they going to be asked to answer on day one of a case? The judge will have some say, but you generally know the question. You know the elements of the conduct that you're trying to prove, and you know the damages. So I always keep that in mind. And then as we're going through trial, I know the sentence in the instruction that I want testimony to support, but I just know that. I don't make a big deal about it. Now my wife is one of the smartest lawyers in our firm. I have her or another one of my law lawyers sitting in the case, and they often help me with briefing and with the argument. And everyone has a job as we go through this, unrelated to me telling the story. And that is, I don't want that evidence to come in. Get me some cases to support that. Or I want to show that this isn't hearsay. I want some cases to support that. And if I can hear a summary from them, I can then stand up and explain to the judge, here's the reason that this comes into evidence. And if you want to excuse the jury, we can brief it a little more thoroughly. I can show you the cases, but here's basically the thumbnail of how it goes. So Gary's point is well taken in that it is all law-driven, but again, it goes back to, you watch John McEnroe hit a cross-court drop shot, you're not going to think that's tennis instruction-driven, but it is. He does it creatively. He does it differently, but he does it fundamentally because he knows how it was supposed to be done from day one. Same with the law. You have the power, though you may not have heard it before, that's the name of this talk, don't let the...
We retitled it.
Yeah, you did? Let me read you what I had.
We thought it was a little wordy. We went with the soul of law. But go ahead.
No, I'm going to tell you. You wait. Okay, here's what I said this title, well, here's what I told Gary, even though he changed it. Let me find it real quick because it's worth it. All right, so he said, you want to talk? He said, yes, send me a topic. So I put, the topic's going to be, don't give your soul to your law degree, give your law degree to your soul. Just because you choose the uncommon practice of law doesn't mean you have to starve. Well, initially you do have to starve. Say no to the man, sleep better at night, and be yourself. A suggested journey through the practice of law. I'm not done. A suggested journey through the practice of law as you step to the cliff's edge of your new profession and wonder, will I fall or will I dive? So there's your wordy, buddy.
I want to again thank Bob Hilliard for coming today and invite everybody to visit with us with pizza. And Bob has agreed to stay around a little bit and meet some of you. And so please feel free to come introduce yourself and enjoy some camaraderie for the next 20 minutes or so.
Thanks, Brad.